You're listening to Soundside. I'm Libby Dankman. Members of the Washington State Clemency and Pardons Board say they feel sidelined by Governor Bob Ferguson. The board hears cases of people currently incarcerated and makes recommendations to the governor for commutations and pardons. In the case of commutations, these recommendations can allow someone to leave prison before their sentence is completed. In Washington state law, someone's case needs to be, quote, extraordinary in order to qualify. Last year, the board heard a little over 30 cases and recommended 10 people for commutations. Governor Ferguson rejected all of the cases, some of which had the support of every board member. The governor has approved pardons for some people who had already completed their sentences. His approach hasn't sat well with members of the Clemency and Pardons Board. Here's an interview with the vice chair of the board, former Seahawks wide receiver Doug Baldwin, on KUOW News.
I would be lying to you if I said that wasn't frustrating. It's very frustrating. Again, you've got 5 people who've been appointed to this board who have dedicated their lives to this work, and some of us, rightfully so, would question what is our value on this board.
When KUOW News asked the governor about his rejection of commutations, he said that most people in the state who looked at these cases would agree with his decision to deny clemency. We reached out to the governor's office for further comment or an interview about this. In response, his office brought up the 10 pardons the governor has approved for people who have completed their sentences. And they also said that the governor considers, quote, the recommendation of the board while also accounting for victim impacts and public safety. These matters involve serious crimes and have serious implications for the safety of the public, and the governor is being very thoughtful about these decisions, end quote. But for members of the board and people who follow the criminal legal system, the governor so far declining to use commutation runs counter to the idea that prison can be a place for reform instead of solely punishment. Raymond De Los Reyes is the chair of the State Clemency and Pardons Board. He is also an attorney in private practice. Raymond, thank you very much for being in studio here.
Glad to be here.
So first off, just for the general audience, what is clemency and what role does clemency play in Washington's carceral system?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. So clemency is the overall process where the governor has the authority to either grant a pardon, which essentially clears a conviction off of somebody's criminal record and criminal history, or grant a commutation, which essentially cuts a incarcerated individual's sentence short. And so those are the 2 types of relief that somebody can petition for under clemency.
And so when I say the governor has approved some pardons, but he has not approved commutations, or what's the differentiation between that?
Yeah, so pardons are generally requested by individuals who are already back out in the community, or maybe they were never sentenced to jail, but the conviction still exists on their record. Whereas commutation is coming from somebody who is incarcerated and is asking the governor to cut their sentence short so that they could be released back into the community.
Got it. How do you and your colleagues on the board weigh the decision when you recommend a commutation or a pardon?
Yeah, so I want to say it was in 2024, the legislature passed a bill where essentially they refined what the criteria is for the board to look at when looking at requests for a pardon versus a request for commutation. Before, it just used to be a universal sort of definition that we would look at extraordinary circumstances. And the definition of that was left to really our own subjective means for every single board member. The legislative fix became such that extraordinary circumstances were only looked at for pardons, but then in the cases of commutations, we're now asked to look at whether the sentence no longer serves the interests of justice. So that's the criteria that we're looking at. And again, while the legislature did give us some guideposts and framework to look at that from, it is again the own subjective definition of each individual board member as to figure out what constitutes extraordinary circumstances or whether the sentence no longer serves the interests of justice.
And what does that mean to you personally, the no longer serves the interest of justice?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of some of the non-exhaustive factors that are listed out both from legislature and also the existing bylaws for the Clemency and Pardons Board, and then just kind of integrating that with my own lived experiences in terms of, where I grew up and what I do as a professional, as a pretty much career-long public defender, when I'm trying to figure out whether a sentence no longer serves the interests of justice, first we're looking at what is the crime and what is the sentence, right? Sometimes we have individuals that come before the board that committed crimes when they were really young. We all know that brain development doesn't really mature until the age of 25. And a lot of these individuals that come before us have committed crimes when they were much, much younger, 17, 18, 19 years old. Then we need to look at what is the impact to the communities from that individual's crime. How impacted were the victim's families, the community at large? And it's essentially just weighing that, right? Has the growth of the individual while they have been incarcerated such that they know this sentence no longer serves the interests of justice, given what we know now about this individual, say in 2026, versus what we knew about the individual, and also, quite honestly, what sentencing laws were and standards, things of that nature, back when the individual committed the crime. Does it still serve the interests of justice for this person to continue to be incarcerated?
Can you give me an example of, say, an offense and the length of time served that you have recommended, you voted to recommend a clemency for?
So let's start with the easiest example, and it's an individual that Professor Dan Berger, who we'll hear from shortly, cited in his article that he published recently regarding Ferguson's stance on clemency. And it's Benjamin Brockie, where he came before the board in June 2024. And at 18, he was convicted of a number of serious offenses and was sentenced to, I want to say, nearly 50 years in prison. And when he came before the board, he was very genuine and authentic in not just his remorse, but also having a plan. He came before the board because he was asking for a commutation of his sentence so that he could accept an offer to go to school at University of Washington. I think that's the kind of individual, not saying that every individual has to follow Ben Brockie's blueprint, but that's the kind of individual that comes before the board and we say to ourselves, this person understands the gravity of his offense. And not only does he understand the gravity of his offense, but he's doing something about it so that when he has the opportunity, it wasn't an if for him, it was a when he has the opportunity to give back to his community, he has a plan to do so. I think that was honestly the easiest case in terms of both clemency and commutation because he was so clear. And to follow up on that, this past June, he graduated from the University of Washington with his bachelor's degree. So here's an individual who I think the board unanimously recommended commutation and clearly followed through.
What is your read on how Governor Ferguson has approached clemency and commutations versus prior governors?
Cautious, I think, is the word that comes to mind when you ask that question. When you look at what he's decided to use his clemency powers for, it's been, the statistics bear out, exclusively for pardons, for individuals who are already out in the community, and you don't necessarily have to deal with whether somebody is a risk to reoffend. They're already out, and you can clearly see in the case of someone who's petitioning for a pardon whether they've reoffended or not.
They've had years to show their track record.
Exactly. Whereas someone who is requesting clemency in terms of commutation, let's be honest about this, it's a risk every time because you really don't know. I think one of the things you asked earlier, what are the things that we take into consideration when we're evaluating petitions and we're looking at the materials that a petitioner submits in terms of a commutation, I think each board member asks themselves, how much of a risk factor is it if we recommend that this person be sent back into the community? And
because that would be the nightmare scenario. Somebody that you recommended then goes on to reoffend in some way.
Exactly. So we're looking at what is their behavior history when they've been incarcerated. We get all of that information. We get information about, how it is that they interact with stakeholders and individuals, especially when put under pressure, right? It is a huge adjustment for somebody who has been incarcerated for a very long time to come back into society and reintegrate. And, really only the most introspective and prepared individuals use that opportunity well. And so I think that really has been, I think, what we've seen out of this particular administration is a cautious approach. I just want to add that, in looking at, and you can see this information clearly online through the Washington State Clemency and Pardons Board website, where the board has pretty much either 4-0 or 5-0 in recommending to grant commutations. Governor Ferguson has denied those every single time. And in the other instances where we've recommended 4-0 or 5-0, some of those are still pending. So I think it's the stats sort of bear out themselves.
I want to bring into the conversation now Dan Berger. He is a professor at the University of Washington, Bothell, and director of the Washington Prison History Project. Thanks for being here, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
So you've written about parole in this state and how incredibly difficult it is to get out of prison, or out of supervision at least, early in Washington, unless you fit a very narrow circumstance. Can you give us some background? Why is that the case? How does Washington approach parole?
Well, for the most part, Washington doesn't have parole. We have a prison problem in this country for the last half century or so that often lives by the name mass incarceration. But mass incarceration is not one thing. It is a series of policy decisions that were made to send more people to prison and to keep them in prison for longer. And so one of the ways that took shape in Washington is through something called the Sentencing Reform Act, passed in the early 1980s, which largely got rid of parole. And so that means if you're sentenced to 20 years, 50 years, or 500 years, by and large, you have to serve that 500 years before you would be released.
Dan, what do you think the message is that the governor's sending with his denials of these clemency recommendations from the board? And in some cases, the non-response to the recommendations, but in many cases, the denials.
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly dangerous and dispiriting message. I think it's a message of hopelessness that it's sending to people who are incarcerated, that, why bother trying to better yourself? There's no end run around. There's no possibility of getting out early. And I don't mean to say that purely transactionally. I think a number of people, as has already been cited, Ben Brocky, but many other people who have bettered themselves in prison because they wanted to be better people. So I want to separate the message the governor is sending from the actions that people who are incarcerated themselves take. But the message he's sending is one so far of just stonewalling any sense of reformation, transformation, and rehabilitation. And so I think it's an incredibly cynical message to people who are incarcerated. But I also think, and I don't want to speak out of turn here for members of the board, but to me, it seems very disrespectful that the state has established this process of having a Clemency and Pardons Board to go through the difficult work of reviewing these cases and making recommendations, and then for the governor to, as of now, ignore them. Just seems disrespectful for the time, effort, and professionalism of the people involved.
Raymond De Los Reyes, chair of the State Clemency and Pardons Board, do you agree with what you just heard from Dan? I mean, in terms of the message the governor's sending and also the work of the board and feeling like the work is going for naught?
I will start by saying that we've got an amazing board who, despite what the governor has chosen to do or not do with our recommendations, are still dedicated to the work in terms of serving the community in this specific role of trying to give individuals, as Professor Berger has noted, hope that their transformation is recognized through this process.
And just, can you speak quickly to that necessity of that hope component? What is the significance of a pathway to a commutation for somebody who is serving a long sentence?
I think when petitioners are specifically asking the governor to grant them commutation, for them, it signifies a part of a chapter that they can place in their journey to be able to complete their rehabilitation. There's a lot of things that individuals can do outside of the four prison walls that they're not able to do when they're incarcerated, whether that's, going to an undergraduate institution and then applying to law school, or in the instance of another individual, being able to engage with worldwide recognized mathematicians, things of that nature. You just can't do that when you have a DOC number attached to your name. And I think it's not just commutations that this administration is being cautious about. There are also a number of individuals who have requested pardons because the collateral consequences we know as a result of the federal administration. There are some individuals who have convictions where the collateral consequences are deportation. And again, the stats bear themselves out that the state administration has rejected those as well.
Dan Berger with the University of Washington. When asked about this, the governor brought up a really extreme case. Somebody's offense was murder with a racial motivation. The governor said basically that this person, murdered an elderly man. There was another shooting earlier in the day. And if anybody, I'm paraphrasing here, if anybody, an average person in the state, heard about this story, they would agree with me if they saw that request. Absolutely. What do you make of the governor's point there?
Well, the point of clemency is not to evaluate the offense that sent someone to prison. I think the governor is confusing the issue there. This is not a chance to weigh in. Does the public support murder? That's not what we're discussing. Does the public support having elderly people spend out their remaining days withering and dying in a prison cell? Does the public agree with that? I think is actually a more apropos question here. The sentence that people got was a reflection of the offense that they were convicted of. What clemency is a process that asks, does this person pose a danger to society? Or let me say that a different way. Does this person stand the opportunity to contribute more to society back in the community as a parent, as a child, as a loved one, as a community member, as an employee, as a trusted advisor and mentor, and so forth, than they do in prison? That's what clemency is a measure of. As Raymond has been saying, we have a number of people in prison who have devoted themselves to all manner of socially transformative behavior, who are writers and artists and amateur policymakers and accomplished lawyers in the making, and so on and so forth.
Journalists in some cases.
Absolutely. A number of award-winning journalists who are incarcerated in Washington. So clemency says, is there any value in keeping these people incarcerated for another 10, 20, 300 years? And I think, frankly, that the public would agree that there's not. Now, there's not going to be consensus on this issue one way or the other. But the fundamental point is that the role of clemency is not an evaluation of the convicting offense. I think all parties involved would agree the offense is wrong and harmful. The question is, has someone paid their debt? The question is, does someone stand to contribute more to society back in the community than they do in prison?
That's Dan Berger, professor at the University of Washington, Bothell, and director of the Washington Prison History Project. Raymond De Los Reyes, chair of the State Pardons and Clemency Board, I want to give you the last word on this. What do you want people to know, and what are your hopes for the future direction of how Governor Ferguson approaches clemency?
I think that petitioners and the communities that are impacted by the petitioner's actions should know that regardless of whether the governor follows our recommendations or not, we're going to continue to do our job the way that we've been tasked to do by the state of Washington, which is to look at every single petitioner's situation individually and determine again whether extraordinary circumstances exist or whether their sentence no longer serves the interests of justice. I think people should also know we make clear to petitioners that when they are given the opportunity for a hearing, we're not here to relitigate or retry or, try to reconstruct what exactly happened with the offense that brought them before the board. What we're trying to figure out is if they're truly transformed and rehabilitated such that we can make a good record for the governor as to why we're making this recommendation. I think, until really our charge changes or we are told to go in a different direction, we're just going to keep doing the work that we signed up to do.
Again, that's Raymond De Los Reyes, chair of the State Pardons and Clemency Board. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. Don't forget you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org or on your favorite podcast app.